Back to square one. Lebanon's Prime Minister-Designate resigns again after failing to form a new government. Who's to blame for this latest setback? And is there political will to pull Lebanon out of this crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Lebanon is sinking deeper into political and economic turmoil. Prime Minister-Designate Saad Hariri has stepped down again after the latest failure to form a new government. He and President Michel Aoun are blaming each other. Many Lebanese vented their anger on the streets of Beirut. The country hasn't had a government in 9 months. Its currency has lost nearly all its value, pushing many into poverty. Food, medicine, and fuel are in short supply. France has called another international aid conference for Lebanon on August 4th, a year after the Beirut port explosion destroyed much of the capital. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, this report from Khoury.
A long political struggle has just become more difficult to resolve. Lebanon's Prime Minister-Designate Saad Hariri, who has been locked in a 9-month power struggle with President Michel Aoun, has failed to form his fourth government.
I met with the president and he demanded what I deem as substantial change to the formation of the government. I suggested to the president if he needed more time to consider my proposal, but he saw no prospect for agreement. For these reasons, I stepped down.
The political paralysis is expected to accelerate the country's economic collapse. Lights are out most of the day. The cash-strapped state barely has money to buy fuel, and there is a shortage of medicine, making life a daily struggle as more Lebanese are pushed into poverty. The local currency, which already lost 95% of its value in recent months, has depreciated further in the hours following Hariri's announcement.
Lebanon needs a government to put in place an economic recovery plan, but that government has to be able and willing to carry out reforms in state institutions. That's the condition set by the international community, which is refusing to issue blank checks after decades of corruption.
But there's also the regional dynamic. Lebanon is entangled in the power struggle between mainly Shia Iran and Saudi Arabia, which used to be an influential player here and a financial supporter to the mainly Sunni Muslim pro-Western camp. It too has stepped aside.
Saudi Arabia is deeply concerned about the growing power and role of Hezbollah in the Lebanese political arrangement. It would look forward for any kind of solution that will curtail Hezbollah's role in the country.
The anger among Lebanon's Sunnis spilled onto the streets. They have long complained their power as a community is being taken away, and any attempt to name a new prime minister without the support of the Sunni leadership headed by Hariri won't solve the crisis. The previous prime minister was chosen by the president and his Muslim Shia allies.
The Sunnites, they believe that since the arrival of General Aoun to the presidency, he's trying to confiscate or to restore part of the lost Christian authorities. The Shia are actually, they have no problem. Whatever the situation is, it's for their benefit. And they know that any changes in this political system is going to be for their benefit and for the Sunnite benefit, because from 50-50 we're going to move to 1/3 part.
Today, the state is deadlocked. The power-sharing agreement between religious communities, which ended Lebanon's civil war in 1990, no longer seems to be working. Khoury, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
All right, let's bring in our guests in Beirut. Rana Khoury, a political activist and campaigner for gender equality. In Istanbul, Bachar El-Halabi, Middle East and North Africa senior geopolitical analyst for ClipperData. And also in Beirut, Christophe Abi-Nassif, director of the Lebanon program at the Middle East Institute. A warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining Inside Story today. Rana, I want to start by talking about the human toll of this political deadlock. The lira has lost 90% of its value. More than half of the population has slipped into poverty. There are fuel shortages and medicine shortages. How much are people in Lebanon struggling right now?
First, hello. I don't know if you're hearing me correctly, because part of the total collapse of Lebanon is also electricity and the internet. Now, it's definitely a very severe humanitarian crisis when it comes to access to basic needs, food, medication. The healthcare system is collapsing day after day. However, this is not a typical humanitarian crisis, so it's not something that was that we couldn't prevent. This is a systematic murder of the Lebanese people and people living in Lebanon. Everything that we're seeing here has the effect of a violent war or an embargo without actually having a violent war or an embargo. It's actually the acts and the years of the ruling of this political class that led to here. We are in a very, very difficult situation. I think the label of that people used to put on the Lebanese people of resilience has totally vanished. We are in a very, very severe situation when it comes to basic access to basic needs. And I think what's the most dangerous now, if you want to talk purely from a humanitarian level, is the total collapse or the day-by-day collapse of the healthcare system, which means people don't have access to medication, but also don't have access to healthcare and to hospitals. And while the ruling mafia is watching, I don't call it a humanitarian crisis. I would like to call it a systematic murder of the Lebanese people, because all of this could have been prevented if we weren't ruled by the people who are ruling us today.
Christophe, did Saad Hariri's resignation come as a complete surprise? Was there any expectation that there might be some last-minute political deal, or was nobody expecting that?
I highly doubt that a lot of people were actually surprised by this resignation yesterday. At the end of the day, it's just a pure continuation of the episodes that we've been seeing over the past month, or really decade or two, of a total incapacity and unwillingness on behalf of the political establishment, and Saad Hariri is part of that establishment, to really be able to push forward the reforms that are needed to be able to revert and at some point recover from the collapse. Therefore, it's clearly not a surprise. 9 months have elapsed, 266 days to be exact. And over the course of these 9 months, the status quo has been maintained, politically at least, which is a total impasse. But what we've seen, and my colleague has touched upon that a couple of minutes ago, is you've just purely seen the depreciation of the currency, the reserves at the central bank that are essential for any recovery effort being depleted without really any purposeful depletion. At least it's not being used for any particular sake. Therefore, it's not a surprise. The political stalemate continues. And if there's one thing that people in Lebanon and hopefully observers and fellow countries outside of the country, if there's one thing they haven't realized by now is, hopefully they do, is that this establishment's days are pretty much over, and they are absolutely incapable of handling, managing, and one day resolving that crisis.
Political impasse continues in Lebanon. I'm curious, from your vantage point, how much has Saad Hariri's resignation complicated this already intractable political crisis?
First of all, hello, and it definitely even complicated even more the situation in the country, because previously there was some sort of a consensus over Hariri leading the government formation process, whether on the international level or whether also locally. Of course, on the regional level, we know that there's a veto or some so-called veto by Saudi Arabia on Saad Hariri particularly, which kind of complicated his drive in order to form, or kind of made him lose leverage in his negotiation process with the different Lebanese stakeholders in terms of forming a government. But the problem is right now, and this is something Saad Hariri signaled last night in a pre-scheduled interview on a local TV station. He said that he will not be naming any candidate to replace him as a prime minister-designate and to form a government, and he might not even give the vote of confidence for this prime minister if he manages to form a government. So what does this mean? This means that any new government that might be formed, that probably the other political stakeholders in the country agree on, will not or will lack the confidence of one of the major constituencies in the country, which makes it hopping on one foot instead of 2 or 3 foot, for example, in terms of applying the much needed reforms. No prime minister will dare touch the very explosive files in the country in terms of reforms without having the full support of all the different factions in the country. This is why Saad Hariri yesterday raised the stakes by announcing that, in addition to the fact that he kind of hinted at the role of Hezbollah basically in not pressuring enough the current sitting president in terms of to drive actually the government formation process, which will also kind of exasperate tension between the different constituencies in the country.
Rana, with this delicate sectarian power sharing system in place in Lebanon, is there any hope that a technocratic and reform-minded government can ever really become a reality in the country?
You know, I think almost 2 years after the revolution, the voices that were actually questioning whether an alternative could work, I think what we are sure about is that the current state is a total failure, and that the people currently ruling us are a total failure, and not only because they are incompetent, but also because they are criminals. And August 4 is the biggest, I think, proof of that. Now, would you tell me that the system is a functional system, and if we get clean people and people that are not criminals, it will work? I don't think we will be in this situation, but I don't think that it would work. I think there is an essential problem in the system today, in our political system, in this power sharing system. And yes, obviously, if we want to be if we want to have a brighter look on Lebanon, we would know that only a secular democratic state would work, especially in today's world, especially with the generation of the revolution, and especially after the systematic failure of the system. This doesn't mean that we don't need an emergency plan today, and that we need people to handle what we have been left with, what these people have actually destroyed in this country. And even any sound mind today that remembers Beirut or think of Lebanon would have never imagined that they would lead us to where we are today. So we need an emergency plan, yes, with the transitional government, if this is possible and realizable, but there is a profound rooting problem within the system we live in, and I don't think it is possible to have a long-term surviving Lebanon with the current system. It is also very delusional to think that the problem is a community and sectarian problem, and that people hate each other because of their sex. We need to make it clear that it is a regime problem, and it is a ruling mafia that has the arms, the militias, the corruption, the money that led people to where they are today. So, you know, it's kind of when you say, oh, but between Israel and Palestine, it's a religious issue. Or it's not. It's a colony that's occupying a people. It's the same thing in Lebanon. So yes, the system is a sectarian system that is completely dysfunctional. But the basic problem are these criminals that led the country to where it is today. So yes, with a change of system, but also yes, with an emergency plan today, because it is also an economic problem, yes, but also a big political problem. It's impossible the same day of the resignation that the lira jumps from 19,000 to 22, 23, 24,000. This means that, of course, we have an economic problem, but it is deeply and the root of it is a political problem. We're not in a real estate crisis. We are in a regime crisis.
Christophe, how difficult is it going to be to find somebody to fill the post vacated by Saad Hariri? And will Mr. Hariri back a replacement?
When it comes to skills and qualifications, definitely not terribly complicated. The problem is, at the end of the day, purely political and not technical and not one of qualifications, which is why, Mohammed, I think there are one of three options in front of us today, and I highly doubt that it's going to be anything other than that. So first of all is, to your point, we do not find a replacement. And what that ends up doing is just creating and cementing this political vacuum that we're now living in. President Aoun did mention that he was going to call for the consultations with Parliament. We don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. So if that does end up happening, then we're going to see a reactivation of the pretty much defunct Diab caretaker government that we have today. So that's option one, pure political vacuum until either total explosion or we end up going towards elections, but elections are really 9 months away and a lot of things can happen then. Option two is just playing the classic consensual democracy card, which is becoming tougher and tougher really to implement, which is where Hariri ends up under international pressure by discussing with allies domestically, whatever's left of his allies domestically, try to potentially float a name that could be accepted by the FPM, by Hezbollah and the coalition there. And then what we'll end up producing really sadly is just yet another government that has absolutely no capacity to deal with the crisis. And hopefully that's one of the lessons learned from the French initiative, that any establishment-linked government is going to be totally incapacitated and unable to do anything on the ground. And then the third point, which was touched upon slightly earlier, and really that's the only way forward to actually be able to manage and get out of the crisis, is this transitional government with exceptional legislative powers, which has been floated months and more than 2 years ago, probably, by a lot of the alternative political parties that will effectively transition us towards a secular civil state and be able to adequately and fairly manage and allocate all of these systemic losses in the crisis. And hopefully that's one of the lessons learned from this entire fiasco and the repeated fiasco for the international community, that what has been tried before is simply no longer working. The Taif agreement is pretty much dead at this stage. The good things about it were never implemented. And what we're living now 30 years later is just the remnants of a failed system that needs to be revamped.
Bachar, the European Union has said it wants to agree by the end of July on a legal framework for a package of sanctions targeting Lebanese leaders. Do you think that the EU will actually do that? And if they do, what would those sanctions look like?
I think the EU is definitely heading in that direction after almost a year of throwing a lifeline for the Lebanese sectarian ruling elite, which symbolized the French initiative by President Emmanuel Macron, who arrived in Beirut right after the August 4 explosion that rocked the heart of the city. So the French were heavily involved in the process of trying to form a government in Lebanon, and they have a first row experience of how difficult, how complex that process is, and who are the disruptive factors in forming a government that can actually start implementing certain reforms to try and save what is left of the country. So, and the French have basically worked relentlessly over the past few months in trying to achieve a consensus within the European Union in order to officially announced their intention of their intention to implement sanctions on Lebanese politicians. What will those sanctions be? I think they're mostly going to target probably tier 1 or tier 2 politicians as a first step, maybe their advisors, their bank accounts, trying to strip them of their visas. We know that many of the members of the sectarian ruling elite in Lebanon kind of have other passports, so they might be banned from travel. And we know that many of the Lebanese politicians actually withdrew their money over the past 2 years or even more, or they transferred their money abroad, and they're kind of relying on those bank accounts outside in order to re-establish themselves in the coming phase in Lebanon, especially when election times come. So this is something that might complicate their plans, the plans of the Lebanese political sectarian elite. But am I too hopeful that this will drive the country and the different Lebanese constituents in order to achieve some sort of an agreement over a new government? I'm not that hopeful, because previously when, for example, the U.S. State Department targeted Gibran Bassil, who is the son-in-law of the current sitting president and who is the head of the largest parliamentary bloc in the parliament, nothing happened. Gibran Bassil did not back down. Gibran Bassil actually leveraged that in order to tighten his relationship with Hezbollah and in order to demand more and more from Hezbollah, which kind of gave him the cushion in the current or in the previous negotiations that were happening with Prime Minister-Designate Saad Hariri in order to refuse or turn down any of the propositions by Hariri, or even turn down the international pressure that was signified whether by the Egyptians or the French or the Americans or what have you. So this is definitely, it is something that should happen. It is something that also reflects on the Europeans in general and They talk about principles and upholding those principles, but will it solve the problem in Lebanon? I'm really skeptical, and we'll see by the end of this month.
Rana, do you think from your vantage point that EU sanctions targeting Lebanese leaders would be in any way effective in putting enough pressure on them to really start trying to enact reforms and potentially starting to turn the situation around?
I don't think this is sufficient and especially where we've headed now. You know, the French initiative and even other foreign powers as well, all their initiative to try to solve the problem and form the government was always being dealt within the same circle of the political ruling class. For me, it's in this extreme situation where our back is against the wall, I think extreme measures should also be taken. Yes, these are people who stole our money and put their money outside. Of course, they shouldn't have access to it. Yes, those are people who kept the nitrate in the port. I don't know, and Beirut blew in its entirety with people. Yes, they should be in jail. So for me, these are reasonable and legal measures to take. I don't think, unfortunately, they are sufficient. Let's take, for example, the US sanctions on Hezbollah, who's today obviously the major ruling party in Lebanon. They were mostly targeted on the banking sector. There were no actual sanctions that could actually limit the power and take over even more parts of or more power shares in the country. So for me, they might be necessary. Actually, they are legal. Today, if you understand in the EU or outside the EU that some people have stolen money or it's laundering money, or it is something that's totally illegal, obviously you have to take by the rule of law and stop it. So it's not a big favor. It's actually applying the law and international law. But I don't think today it's sufficient. I think we have to have a total, or any country today in the world should have a total breakup with the current regime, a total breakup, and stop pushing for a solution within the actual caste, if you want, or the actual system that we have. Because as we've seen, it's not working.
Christophe, I just want to take a look at the big picture here for a moment. Does the political will, from your vantage point, does the political will exist right now to pull Lebanon out of this current crisis?
It does not. And I think at this stage, it's no longer a matter of political will. It's a matter of things being enforced and the balance of power really changing, and the cost benefit analysis that political parties and the main political players in Lebanon are thinking through and reconsidering and reassessing in light of regional dynamics, some rapprochement, the potential deal or lack thereof between the US and Iran, etc. So people are still at this stage, in a way, lacking agency to conduct any real reform and to make any real political decision-making. Lebanon is a tiny country. What needs to be done has been clear for years now. We know where the problems are. It's just a matter of having the right, in a way, sticks and carrots, but also the right institutional setup in place where regional powers, international powers, but more importantly, people in Lebanon can step up to the stage and take matters into their own hands in a way, not necessarily by violence and all of that, but by pure political organizing, so that balance of power that is still to this stage on the side of establishment parties ends up switching, and then realities will then be different. And that in itself, with the support of things such as potential sanctions, which are tools rather than policy, and with an entire revamping of the political system, which once again is pretty much dead at this stage, could impose, and that's why it's not a will, it's more of an imposition of new realities on the ground that will help us hopefully unclog these issues.
You know, regional and international mediation has failed to bridge the differences between Lebanese leaders. Is there any international actor at this point who can play a more effective mediating role?
I mean, it's not an effective mediating role as much as it's a role of pushing things forward. And I think the only player, a regional player that can do that is actually Iran, surprisingly, or not, because the main powerhouse in Lebanon at the moment is Hezbollah, and Hezbollah can dictate things almost entirely on the different constituencies of the country. And Hezbollah is the closest ally of the president and retains very good relations with all the different constituencies. No one today opposes Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon. No one wants to fight against Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. So Hezbollah holds the keys, if it wants, to drive the situation forward. But I don't think it has intentions to do that. And the trade-off or the cost-benefit approach, which Christophe mentioned, is still not ripe enough for it to move forward from the current regime in its form and the current balances, which favors its influence over the country.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Rana Khoury, Bachar El-Halabi, and Christophe Abi-Nassif. And thank you too for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.